the Labour leader, Sir Keir Starmer, refused to rule out 12 times in interviews the other day the possibility of doing a deal with the Lib Dems at the next general election. The former Lib Dem leader is with us in the studio, Sir Vince Cable, with us now. Since you wrote about this yesterday, if it's going to be a hung parliament, Labour would very likely to do a deal with your party.
Well, I think they would be looking... They may win an overall majority,
yes.
Of course, that's possible.
Yeah.
They may not win at all. I mean, we're dealing with hypothetical situations. Yeah. But there is one set of circumstances in which Labour don't have an overall majority. And I think if they have any sense, they will be looking for a period of 5 years stable government rather than living from hand to mouth, in which case they would need the cooperation of other parties. I think they would be very foolish to lean to the SNP or the DUP, and that leaves the Lib Dems, who I think, I don't know the internal thinking, I'm not part of it, but I think the thinking is that we would want to be responsible and provide good government, as indeed we did with the coalition 10 years ago.
And what would the price be? Would it have to be a deal on proportional representation?
Well, I think if there was a cooperative agreement, then there is a whole lot of policy issues that would come into play. And I think one of them would be electoral reform, which matters not just for our own self-interest, but in terms of having a fairer, wider voting system. So that would be important, but it can happen in different ways. And there are other issues. Radical decentralisation is another issue that's very much on the agenda, rebuilding our links with the European Union, and all of these things are matters for the new government that we would potentially try to influence. But not, I think, as a coalition. I think that's unlikely, though Ed Davey wisely hasn't ruled it out.
You were in the coalition government. You were a Secretary of State in the coalition government. It was a pretty bruising outcome for the Lib Dems in the end. You were almost obliterated in the 2015 election.
It was. I think the formula most people would agree with is that we provided very good government for 5 years, but it was very bad for the party. Good for the government, good for the country, but not good for the party. The reason we ultimately lost, and as a acutely observing journalist, you would have noticed this. And what really did us harm was the fear in 2015 of red Ed on the Scottish nationalists. I don't think the Conservative campaign would work again in that way. So I think probably we'll be less damaged. But coalition isn't good for small parties. Yeah.
Why do you think the Lib Dems did so well, Vince, in the local elections? Because the feeling is that Lib Dems make very good local constituency MPs and councillors, but they can't make that reach nationally.
Well, I think, the whole point about the coalition government was it defeated that argument. We actually were very good in government. We had good ministers, influenced a lot of policies in a good way. So, we've had that exposure at national level. That's not a plausible argument anymore. The reason we did well was good local campaigning. We've run most of the big cities of Britain at some time. We're now very strong in the south of England and some outposts in the north, like Hull. So partly local, but partly disaffection with the government, which is very intense. And a lot of tactical voting in our support.
I was going to say about the tactical voting was a lot of that. Do you think at the general election the Lib Dems should stand aside in some seats where they know they can't win to let Labour perhaps defeat the Tories, and vice versa, Labour stand aside in seats where you can beat the Tories?
I don't think there's any question of parties standing aside. The Lib Dems and Labour, I'm sure, will put up a full slate of candidates. But what happened in 1997, when the Labour Paddy Ashdown landslide happened, was that there was a sort of general understanding that you concentrate your resources in those seats which you can win, which is you have to do under the first-past-the-post system. And we did very well. We doubled our numbers, more than doubled our numbers, and Labour under Blair got in with a massive majority. So I think a repetition of 1997 tacit understandings is very much on the cards.
Let's bring Jonathan in, because Lord Jumani, you were his junior minister.
I served under the reign of terror of Vince, yes, for several months. But actually, funny enough, I was talking to a couple of very strong Tories yesterday. They both said that we've never been as good as since the coalition. And of course, Vince and I are bound to say that because we were in the coalition government. But it was a great pleasure working. I originally started working with Chris Huhne as his number 2 in energy, and he was really good to work with. People like Alexander and Vince, I thought, were excellent in what they did. And the interesting thing about the next election is, where is the division? We're looking like two social democratic parties, or three actually. And what's the choice? And maybe the choice actually will be that we go into a Tory Lib-Dem coalition again. But I suspect there's Bruce. Actually, I worked for Ed for a month.
Ed Davies,
yeah. So
could they do that again?
I'm not sure who this third Social Democratic Party is. Are you thinking of the Tories?
No, I'm thinking Labour and the Tories and the Social.
Oh no, well that's a bit of a stretch.
And the Liberal Democrats. I think we've all become Social Democrat parties.
Well, I think the differentiation is much stronger than that. No, I think nothing can be ruled out, nothing should be ruled out, but the chances of a Conservative Lib-Dem coalition again are vanishingly small, I think.
No, I think that's right. I think I was being slightly mischievous. But
if there is a Labour Lib-Dem coalition, Jonathan, and they do push through electoral reform, what would that mean for the Conservatives?
It would be bad news for Labour and the Conservatives, proportional representation.
Worse for the Conservatives, though, right?
Who knows? I mean, I think that I still don't rule out Rishi winning the next election. I think if he can deliver on the 4 or 5 things that he's set out, and that we see taxes being reduced, inflation coming down, immigration being dealt with, then I think people will say, my choice between 2 Social Democrats of Starmer and Sunak, we might continue to stick with the devil we know, in a sense. And he's really brought some steadiness back into government, which is what the nation needs. So I don't rule him out winning again. In fact, I've got a bet on it. So, what
were the odds?
7-1.
And how much did you put on?
I better not tell you.
I know, but I won't say, as you told me. Let's get Vince on PR, though, Vince.
Did you put any money on that, Vince?
I mean, PR, the Tories will project it. If you vote Labour, or if you vote Liberal Democrat, we're going to have potentially a hung parliament and a proportional representation, which is a recipe for chaos and bad government. You look at Italy, governments every other year. Why do you think PR would be so much better for the way the country's going?
Well, I didn't use the phrase PR.
No.
PR is one particular version.
Well, you tried AV last time, and that didn't work.
We clearly need electoral reform. There are different ways of doing it. The Jenkins report that was commissioned under Tony Blair gave a very good formula that I think meets the British tradition of constituency MPs with additional top-ups. It's more the German model, and that would work, but, that remains to be explored. It certainly isn't a recipe for chaos. I mean, you may or may not like what the German coalition is doing, but they're very stable, and most of the successful Western European governments are coalitions of some form or the other. So it's certainly nothing to be frightened of. I think we're not talking about actually a coalition after the next election. I think it's very unlikely. But if that is the long-term outlook, we should embrace it.